Today, we are going to go over how to unravel thrifted sweaters so that you can reuse the yarn at a fraction of what it would cost to buy a new one. Because here is something most people never think about. That sweater hanging on the rack at your local thrift store for $5 or $6 contains yarn. Real yarn. Yarn that was spun, dyed, and knit into a garment by a machine or by hand, and that yarn does not expire. The fibers inside that sweater are still structurally sound. At the molecular level, the keratin proteins in wool and cashmere are held together by disulfide bonds, which are among the strongest bonds found in biological materials. A single wool fiber can bend over 20,000 times before it breaks. Cotton breaks after 3,000. That sweater has years of life left in its fiber, and the only reason it ended up donated is because somebody got tired of wearing it. Their loss, your gain. Now I am not just talking about saving money, although you absolutely will. I am talking about access. Access to fibers you might never buy new. I typically do not spend more than $8 on a sweater at the thrift store. And at those prices, I regularly find silk sweaters, cashmere sweaters, merino wool sweaters, blends that would cost you $60, $80, even $100 if you bought the equivalent yardage new. Unraveling gives you permission to experiment. You can try cashmere for the first time without the financial risk. You can build a yarn stash that would make any knitter jealous, and you can do it on a budget that does not require you to choose between your craft and your groceries. But here is the thing. You cannot just grab any sweater off the rack and start pulling yarn. If you do that, you are going to waste your time, ruin good fiber, and get frustrated enough to quit before you ever finish your first unraveling session. There is a method to this. There is a science to selecting the right garment, preparing it safely, deconstructing it in the correct order, and finishing that reclaimed yarn so it performs like new. And that is exactly what I am going to walk you through today. Step by step, from the thrift store rack to a finished skein ready for your needles or your hook. I am also going to show you a washing technique later in this video that removes stitch memory from reclaimed yarn so effectively that you will not believe the before and after. But we are not there yet. Let us start at the very beginning, selection. When you are standing in that thrift store looking at a wall of sweaters, the very first thing you need to do before you check the price, before you check the color, before you check the size, is look at the seams. This is the single most important step, and the one that separates people who successfully reclaim yarn from people who go home with a tangled mess and a bad attitude. Turn the sweater inside out right there on the rack. Nobody will bother you. Look at where the sleeve meets the body or where the side seams run. You are looking for one specific thing, a chain stitch. A chain stitch is a series of interlocking loops that holds the panels of the sweater together. And when you find it, it means the sweater was constructed from separate knitted panels that were joined after knitting. That is what you want, because it means the yarn inside each panel is one continuous strand that you can unravel completely. If instead you see an overcast edge, or something that looks like it was sewn with a sewing machine, that zigzag or overlocked stitch that runs along a cut edge, put it back. That means the fabric was knit as a large piece, then cut into pattern shapes and sewn together, just like how you would cut woven fabric. When knitted fabric is cut, the yarn at every cut edge is severed. That means instead of one long continuous strand, you get short pieces of yarn, one per row, each maybe 18 inches long. Unless you have the time and patience to splice every single one of those ends together, that sweater is not going to give you usable yarn. Look for the chain stitch. That is your green light. Now, the chain stitch itself has an orientation, and this matters more than you might think. If you look closely at the chain, you will see that the little V shapes that make up each link are pointing in a particular direction. There is a top of the V and a bottom, and the previous chain stitch pierces through in a specific way. When you eventually go to unravel that chain stitch to separate your panels, you want to be working with that orientation, not against it. Going with the grain, so to speak, lets the chain unzip smoothly. Going against it turns it into a fight, I will show you exactly how to work with this when we get to the unraveling step. The second thing you check is the label. Flip that sweater around and find the content tag. You are looking for natural fibers. Wool, cashmere, merino, silk, alpaca, mohair, angora, or blends of these. These are the fibers worth reclaiming, because they have structural memory, meaning they spring back after being deformed. When you squeeze a wool fabric and release it, it recovers. It fights back. That fight is the keratin trying to return to its natural crimp pattern, and it is exactly what makes reclaimed wool feel alive again after washing. Cotton and linen can be unraveled too, but they have less bounce, less recovery, and the results are not as dramatic. I personally do not prefer to buy acrylic or majority acrylic sweaters for unraveling. Acrylic is cheap enough new that there is no real advantage to reclaiming it. But I will be honest, sometimes a sweater is just too beautiful, or the color is too perfect, and I grab it anyway regardless of fiber content. That is your call to make. Just know that the real treasures, the finds that make this whole process feel like you struck gold, are the natural fiber sweaters. Especially cashmere, especially silk blends, especially fine merino. Save that tag. This is a small tip that will save you headaches later. When you eventually separate the sweater into panels and start unraveling, take the content label and attach it to your finished yarn with a small safety pin. You want to remember what this fiber is. 6 months from now, when you pull that skein out of your stash and you cannot remember if it is wool or a wool-silk blend, that little tag is going to be your best friend. Get in the habit now. If the label is missing, you can identify fiber by hand. Squeeze the fabric between your thumb and forefinger, press firmly and release. Wool and cashmere spring back immediately. Cotton stays compressed. It wrinkles and does not fight. Acrylic feels slippery and slightly plastic when you roll it between your fingers. If you want a definitive answer, you can do a burn test at home. Clip a tiny snippet of yarn from an interior seam. Hold it with tweezers and bring a flame to the tip. Animal fibers burn slowly, smell like burning hair, and leave a soft, crushable ash. Plant fibers burn faster, smell like burning paper. Synthetics melt into a hard plastic bead and smell like chemicals. That test removes all guessing. Now here is a step that almost nobody talks about in unraveling tutorials, and it is critically important. Moth-proofing. If you are a knitter or crocheter with any kind of yarn collection at home, if you have wool in your stash, if you have antique knitting pieces or heirloom blankets, you need to hear this. When you bring a thrifted sweater into your home, you are potentially bringing moth eggs or larvae with it. Clothes moth larvae eat keratin. They will chew through your wool, your cashmere, your mohair. They will destroy your stash, and they are so small. You will not see them until the damage is done. So the very first thing I do when I bring thrifted sweaters home, before I even think about unraveling, is moth-proof them. There are 2 methods I use. The one I prefer is the oven method. I turn my oven to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 77 degrees Celsius, and I place the sweaters inside for about 40 minutes. Heat kills moth eggs and larvae at every stage. You want to make sure there is good space between the sweaters and that they are not touching the sides of the oven. I have charred sweaters before by letting them rest against the oven wall, so be cautious with placement. If the sweater has a significant synthetic content, if it is part acrylic or polyester, do not put it in the oven. Synthetics and heat are a bad combination. For those sweaters, I use the freezer method. Put the sweater in a sealed bag and leave it in the freezer for a minimum of 3 days. The cold kills the larvae. After either treatment, I feel confident that the sweater is safe to be near the rest of my yarn collection. Do not skip this step. One infested sweater can destroy hundreds of dollars worth of stash yarn. 10 minutes it takes to moth-proof is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy. All right, your sweater is selected, it is moth-proofed, and it is ready to work on. Now we unravel. Grab a seam ripper, because that is going to be your primary tool for this part. Turn the sweater inside out, so you have full access to all the seams. We are going to separate this sweater into its individual panels before we unravel anything. Most sweaters have 4 main panels: a front, a back, and 2 sleeves. Some have more depending on design, but 4 is standard. The seam I always start with is the one that runs under the arm and down the side of the body, because on most commercially knit sweaters, this seam is continuous. It goes from the underarm all the way down the side in one unbroken chain stitch. Find that chain stitch seam. Identify the orientation of the V shapes in the chain, and go to the end where unraveling will be easiest, where you are working with the direction of the chain, not against it. Take your seam ripper and slide it right underneath the top chain stitch at your starting point. Pop through it. Be careful not to catch the actual garment yarn underneath. You only want to cut the chain stitch thread. Once you break that first link, you will see a loop sticking up. Do not pull that loop. Go into the loop it is sticking through and pull on that one. It will release the loop before it, and now you have a loose end. Pull on that end and watch the chain stitch unravel down the seam. At several points along the way, you can start gently pulling the panels apart. They will separate as the chain stitch releases. When you get to the underarm area, things can get slightly tricky. You often have 2 chain stitches crossing each other at that junction. Sometimes they separate easily, sometimes they need a bit of persuading with the seam ripper. Just go slow. When you reach the garment tags, those are sewn on separately, so carefully use the seam ripper to remove all the tag stitching. The more of those tag threads you can remove now, the better. Any little threads left behind from the tag will snag and hinder your unraveling later. Continue this process with every seam until you have separated the sweater into all its panels: front, back, both sleeves. Cuffs and ribbing sections can be especially difficult to unravel because they often use a tighter construction or sometimes even a different joining thread. I usually leave the cuffs for last, and sometimes I set them aside entirely, saving that yarn for a separate small project or for splicing later. Do not let a stubborn cuff discourage you. The body panels and upper sleeves are where the majority of your yardage lies. Now that your sweater is in pieces, we need to figure out which direction to unravel each panel. This trips people up, and if you get it wrong, you will be pulling against the direction of the knitting and the yarn will lock up on you. You will think the panel is felted when it is not. You were just pulling the wrong way. Every knitted panel was constructed in a direction. It was either knit from the bottom up or the top down. Your job is to find the end that was finished last, because that is where you start unraveling. You are reversing the construction order. The last thing that was done is the first thing you undo. On most commercially knit sweaters, the bind-off edge is at the top, near where the panel was attached to the collar or the shoulder seam. Sometimes you will get lucky, and the top edge will already be starting to come loose on its own, especially if the pieces were joined using live stitches rather than a traditional bind-off. When that happens, you already have your starting point. The yarn is practically waving at you saying, "Start here." If the top edge is not already loose, look for a small tail of yarn, a little thread end that was used to secure the last row. That tail is your key. Now, I find it easiest in most cases to simply cut very close to that secured edge rather than trying to pick it apart stitch by stitch. Yes, you lose a tiny bit of yarn, maybe a few inches, but you save yourself 10 minutes of frustration trying to unpick a tightly woven-in end, and you get a clean starting point for smooth unraveling. I save those little scraps, by the way. I have a container for them. There are uses for short bits of yarn, and I will talk about those in a future video. Before you start unraveling full speed, pull out a few inches of yarn by hand first. Get a nice smooth length coming freely off the panel before you commit to winding. The start tends to be the fiddliest part. You might see some little fuzzies where the yarn was cut or where stitches are releasing. Just clear those gently with your fingers. Once you have a smooth lead of yarn flowing freely, you are ready to go. Now here is something that catches people completely off guard, and it happens in about half of the commercially knit sweaters I find. The panel is knit with 2 yarns at the same time. 2 separate strands, knit together as one, twisted around each other throughout the fabric. You will notice it immediately when you start pulling, because the yarn will unravel for a few inches and then suddenly stop. It locks up. And the reason it locks up is because the two strands are intertwined. You cannot just pull one strand continuously. You have to alternate. Unravel a bit of the first strand, then unravel a bit of the second strand, then go back to the first, then the second. They take turns because they are twisted around each other inside the fabric. This is, honestly, the most tedious part of unraveling commercially made sweaters. If your sweater has a single yarn, the unraveling is almost meditative. You pull and the yarn flows, and it is deeply satisfying. If your sweater has two yarns, it becomes a coordination exercise. You are managing two strands simultaneously, keeping them from tangling, winding them separately, and it requires patience. I will be honest with you. If I did not have a system for handling this, I probably would have given up on two-yarn sweaters entirely. What I do is set one strand on a ball winder that I crank by hand and feed the other strand through a separate winding setup. One strand is being handled mechanically, one is being handled manually, and between the two it stays manageable. If you are doing this at home without any special equipment, it is absolutely still possible. It is just slower. Wind a bit of one strand into a ball, then wind a bit of the other, back and forth. Put on a podcast, except that this particular sweater is going to take a full evening instead of 30 minutes. The yarn is still worth it. I have not found a reliable way to tell in the store whether a sweater is knit with one yarn or two. If anyone watching this has figured that out, please share that knowledge, because it would save all of us a lot of surprise. For now, I treat it as a coin flip. Sometimes you get the easy single yarn sweater and the unraveling just flows. Sometimes you get the double and you settle in for the long haul. Either way, the fiber at the end is the same quality. As you unravel, wind your yarn into loose skeins or hanks. Do not wind tight balls. This is important. The yarn coming off that sweater has been held in the same stitch formation for months or years. Every loop, every twist has been locked into a position, and the fiber remembers. This is called stitch memory, and when you unravel, the yarn comes off looking like curly ramen noodles. It is kinked, it is wavy, it is nothing like smooth yarn from a new skein. If you wind it tightly into a ball right now, you are setting those kinks under tension, which makes them harder to remove later. Loose hanks let the fiber relax. We are going to fix those kinks in the next step, washing. This is where your ramen noodle yarn transforms into something genuinely beautiful, and it is simpler than you think. Tie your hanks in at least 3 or 4 places with loose figure-8 ties using scrap yarn, or even just strips of fabric. This keeps the hank from becoming a tangled disaster in the water. Fill a basin with cool water, not warm, not hot, cool. If your yarn has any wool content at all, temperature is your enemy. Hot water plus agitation equals felting, and felting is permanent and irreversible. If you accidentally felt your reclaimed yarn, it is over. That fiber is done. So we stay cool and we stay gentle. Add a small amount of gentle detergent. I just use my regular laundry detergent, nothing fancy. Submerge the hanks and let them soak. Do not agitate, do not scrub, do not wring. Just gently squeeze the hanks a few times to let the water and soap penetrate, then let them sit. I usually let mine soak for at least 20 to 30 minutes. You are cleaning out years of body oils, deodorant residue, dust, and whatever else that sweater has been through. After soaking, rinse in cool water. Again, gentle, no wringing, no twisting. Just let clean water run through the fiber or submerge in fresh water and press gently. Now, if your yarn has wool content, here is an extra step I always do. A diluted vinegar rinse. Wool loves vinegar. It is a natural deodorizer. It helps restore the pH balance of the fiber, and it leaves the yarn feeling softer and cleaner than detergent alone. Just a splash of white vinegar in a basin of cool water. Give the hanks a final soak in that for 5 or 10 minutes, then press out the water gently. To dry, I press the hanks in a clean towel. rolling them up and stepping on the towel to squeeze out as much moisture as possible without wringing. Then I hang them. I use hangers on my shower rod, draping the hanks over the hanger bar so they hang freely. Let them dry completely, overnight at minimum. You want that yarn bone dry before you work with it. Any residual moisture can cause mildew in your stash, and nobody wants that. When you take those hanks down the next morning, you are going to notice something remarkable. The ramen noodle kinks are mostly gone. The soaking and the weight of the water while hanging applied gentle, even tension across the fiber as it dried. The keratin resettled into a straighter, smoother configuration. There might still be a slight wave to the yarn, a subtle memory of its previous life, but it is dramatically improved. It is usable, it is knittable, and if you hold it next to a skein of new yarn of the same fiber type, you will be genuinely surprised at how close they feel. At this point, you have several options. You can use the yarn exactly as it is. Wind it into balls or cakes, grab your needles or your hook and start your next project. The yarn is clean, it is smooth enough to work with, and it will produce a perfectly good fabric. I knit up a swatch from the yarn I reclaimed and it looked great. Clean stitches, good drape, consistent tension. Totally usable. But maybe the yarn you reclaimed is thinner than what your pattern calls for. Maybe it is a fingering weight and you need a worsted weight. This is actually one of the most exciting possibilities that unraveling opens up. Because you can combine reclaimed yarns from different sweaters to create exactly the weight and color blend you need. You can hold 2 or 3 strands together and knit them as one, which is the simplest approach. Or, if you have access to a spinning wheel or even a drop spindle, you can ply the strands together properly. If you are going to ply reclaimed yarn, you will want to run each strand through a spinning wheel or spindle first with either a Z or S twist to restore the energy and structure to the individual strand. Then, you ply 2 or more strands together in the opposite direction. The result is a custom yarn that is thicker, stronger, and uniquely yours. You can blend colors from different sweaters. You can combine fibers, maybe a cashmere strand with a merino strand for a blend that has the softness of one and the durability of the other. This is where unraveling stops being just a money-saving trick and starts becoming actual fiber artistry. You are engineering your own yarn from reclaimed materials. That is something most knitters never even consider possible. Let me leave you with this. The modern yarn industry has trained us to think of yarn as something we buy new, in neat skeins from a shelf, and there is nothing wrong with that. I will always support yarn shops and independent dyers. But the idea that yarn is single-use, that once it has been knit into a garment its life is over, that is a very modern invention. For most of human history, fiber was too valuable and too labor-intensive to produce to be discarded after one use. Garments were unraveled and reknit when they wore out. The yarn was the treasure, not the sweater. We have simply forgotten that. So here is what I want you to do this week. Visit one thrift store, turn 5 sweaters inside out, look at the seams, identify which ones have chain stitches, and which ones were cut and sewn. Check the fiber content labels, squeeze the fabric and feel whether it springs back. Buy one sweater that passes all the tests, take it home, moth-proof it, separate it into panels and unravel just one sleeve, wash it, hang it to dry. In the morning, hold that yarn in your hands, feel how soft it is, feel how alive it still is. You just turned a $6 thrift store sweater into beautiful, usable yarn that would have cost you 5 or 10 times that amount new, and you did it yourself. That is the skill, that is the secret. The yarn is already out there, waiting in thrift stores and estate sales and consignment shops all over your city, priced at almost nothing because the world forgot what fiber is worth. Now you remember, so go find it. Happy unraveling.